Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
President Trump pushed back against doubts over his seriousness on the tariff deadline. He said the August 1st deadline won't be extended, while hinting on progress towards a deal with the European Union. Joining us now to discuss this in more detail is John Clarke, a former EU trade negotiator and director of international affairs at the European Commission. John, thank you for joining us on such a busy morning when it comes to news about trade. How are you reading the latest comments from the US and the EU on this? Does it sound like they're close to a deal to you?
I think this is the most difficult negotiation in memory, frankly, for the European Union, and I would not want to be an EU trade negotiator on this one. And the goalposts are moving all the time. The EU is negotiating with a gun against its head of a 20% or 50% tariff in August, depending on what day of the week it is. There are doubts, I think, whether any deal that Trump inks will be actually honoured. And then the Commission is very divided about whether it should stick to principles, not accept anything which is W2 illegal, or be quote-unquote pragmatic and go for a quick, dirty deal of the kind that the British did. And again, member states are also quite divided. And then we've got the whole Ukraine dimension, which in the background. So it's a very difficult situation. There's no white smoke coming out of the Brussels at the moment, but there have been a few hints and signs that a deal may be reached today or overnight tomorrow, which would basically be EU accepting that there will be a 10% tariff more or less across the board, carve-outs for Airbus or aircraft, aerospace, and wines and spirits. The big issue will be whether there can be a carve-out and no tariffs for cars and pharmaceuticals, which are of enormous importance to several member states. So this is a very difficult negotiation. I think nobody will be happy with the result, but I don't think the EU is willing to go to a full-blown trade war with the USA, because that would end any prospect of the US sticking in there with support for Ukraine.
You pointed to some of the complexity of this arrangement. We've been speaking to our reporters who've been giving details on some of those carve-out negotiations that have been happening as well. I mean, is that going to be enough for EU member states if there are managed to be successful in carve-outs for wine and spirits and aircraft parts? As we've been discussing, the cars issue seems even more complicated. No,
I don't think that would be satisfactory. The auto sector is very important. The pharmaceutical sector is very important, and I think at least one of those sectors would need to get a carve-out, i.e., a zero duty exporting to the USA. If none of them are there, I don't think the EU could accept a deal.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. Trump did mention that 200% tariff, that threat on pharmaceuticals, but he did mention a longer timeline when he threatened that, saying companies will have a year and a half to move production to avoid that kind of tariff. But I want to maybe dig into a little deeper on the auto situation. There was some reporting that some German car makers would be given maybe some reprieve, such as BMW, Mercedes, and Volkswagen, who produced some cars in the U.S. They'll be given maybe a quota of some tariff-free imports. What's the latest reading on the discussions around the auto sector?
Well, I'm not privy to the discussions. They're in the so-called tunnel now, in great secrecy. But there are lots of ways in which you can carve out or craft a deal on autos, which would, as you said, involve boosting production in the USA, which BMW is quite able to do, Volkswagen as well. The Japanese have been doing it with Hyundai, and offsetting that against increased imports from Europe. So, I mean, anything is possible.
What about the question of the tech rules? This is something that Donald Trump has brought up again and again, and even last night while he was saying that the EU and Ursula von der Leyen had been, quote, very nice recently, he still pointed to some of the fines being issued to big tech companies in from the US but by the EU. Now, our conversations with the European Commission have said that they're not looking to change the rules. Stéphane Séjourné told us that only around a week ago. Is that something that could a compromise, do you think, be found around that, where the EU could be seen to be giving something on that area to the US without necessarily giving up on its framework?
No, I don't. I think on this, the EU will not waive its legal requirements and its enforcement requirements on big tech, on data platforms. I mean, only last week, the EU fined Apple 500 million euros for anti-competitive behaviour in terms of access to its apps site. I mean, I think that's a very clear sign that the EU is not going to give up on its the Digital Services Act or other tech regulations. I think that would be a bridge too far, and it's hard to see what kind of sweetheart understanding could be made otherwise. So I don't think this area is going to feature very strongly in any EU-US deal.
Can you talk to us about a little bit about how you're viewing, the broader trade situation within the EU, outside the EU with partners other than the US? Do you think that this is putting more strain on their relationship with China, for example?
Well, that's one of the big unknowns that I've been writing about quite a bit and commenting on. I would be very unhappy if any EU-US deal included commitments to bash China in any kind of WTO illegal manner. Obviously, the US want the EU to align with it in hitting China in whatever ways it can. That would be very, very unwise and dangerous approach, I think. The EU should not be forced to choose between America and China, not least because we have a summit coming up, EU-China, in a few days. And I think we don't want to see a breakdown in EU-China relations at this particular point in time.
Just coming back to the negotiations with the US, I'm wondering if what you would see as being the red lines that the EU won't cross to get a deal. Obviously, there's a lot of pressure and we're told there's progress. But I just wonder from your experience negotiating on behalf of the EU, what issues you think that could see all of this fall apart over? Well,
I think there are two red lines, perhaps two and a half. One is that I don't think the European Union would accept to give the USA any preferential market access for US exports. That would be clearly illegal under WTO. And the EU does, I think, still care about its credibility and as a defender of multilateralism and the kind of international rules. So I think that's not going to happen. That would be a red line for the European Union. I think the second one is, as I said earlier, the EU will not, in my opinion, accept a deal in which there is no improved access for pharmaceuticals or cars. One or the other, perhaps not both, but one or the other. So I think they will demand good treatment for either their pharma or their car exports. And then thirdly, the half is that, as I said, I don't think the EU would accept to agree with the Americans any kind of, again, WTO illegal actions against China.
John, thank you very much for joining us this morning. John Clarke, their former EU trade negotiator, Director for International Affairs at the European Commission. We appreciate your insights as we're watching for the latest news out of those trade talks.